Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now begin the final session of today's forum entitled Social Media Shift, How Media Affects Wars and Conflicts. Now I would like to invite our distinguished moderator, Ms. Nailah Huda, on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Nailah Huda is a news anchor and journalist at Astro Awani, as well as Awani Global Affairs. And our distinguished speakers for this session are Dr. Shashi Jayakumar, Head Center of Excellence for National Security from S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore. Ms. Munirah Mustaffa, the Executive Director of Chesseur Group and Non-Resident Fellow at Washington, D.C. New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. And finally, our honorable speaker that will join us virtually, Mr. Don Pathan, Senior Program Officer for Regional Security Cooperation at the Asian Foundation, Thailand. And now we hand over the session to our moderator, Ms. Nailah. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Assalamualaikum and a very good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm Nailah Huda. I'm from Astro Awani. Maybe you might not know me. Maybe you might know me from my hair, but it's tied up a bit, so maybe you don't recognize me. But I'm very happy to be here. I'm very honored to be sharing the stage and to be in the same hall with highly esteemed speakers standing or sitting right next to me. And this is the third session of today's conference, the final session for the day. So I'm hoping that we get to end this with a bang. Probably not the right choice of words for a security conference, but I try. So, just like the previous sessions with my colleague Cynthia, we'll be hearing from the speakers for about 15 minutes each, and then we hope to hear some questions from the floor for a round of Q&A at the end. But what might be a little different from the previous sessions is what we're about to discuss. So previously we got to hear a lot of great insights, a lot of great ideas about security, about civil-military relations, about conflict on not necessarily a higher level per se, but on a different level. But for the next hour or so, we're looking to discuss similar issues of security, of defense, of civil-military relations, of current security issues, but on a level that I would find virtually much closer to every one of us. And it's going to be a bit tough to follow from the previous sessions as well, because just like Prof. Datuk Zakaria said, what else is there to be said after we've heard from the generals, right? But I'm going to pick a very easy and very predictable example for the topic of the hour. I want to look at Ukraine. Because in the past few weeks, we got to see a wartime president delivering speeches on Twitter and Facebook. We got to see live streams of cities being bombed, and some of the earliest reports about Russian troops rolling into Ukraine from TikTok. So, this is not the first so-called social media war, but it could very well be the most viral, the most well-documented on social media. But beyond looking at the president, looking at ministers tweeting updates, we got to see first-hand accounts of war and conflict from citizens, rapidly shaping narratives about this conflict. and drawing the attention of the entire digital world. And when things got worse and international news agencies had to flee, these accounts on social media were crucial in conveying what was happening on the ground. But this raises a lot of questions. Does this create more room for transparency or more room for misinformation, propaganda perhaps? How has the speed, the spread of disseminating information change and influence wars today? How can we improve and safeguard the current environment and framework of reporting in wartime? And hopefully to be able to answer some of these questions is our lineup of panelists, speakers next to me and virtually. First up, we have Dr. Shashi Jayakumar, Senior Fellow, Head of Center of Excellence for National Security, Executive Coordinator of Future Issues and Technology, RSIS Singapore, and previously a Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy with research interests including extremism, cyber, social resilience, and political history. And then after that, we want to hear from Ms. Munirah Mustaffa, who recently founded Chesseur Group and serving as its Executive Director and Principal Consultant. Also a non-resident fellow at New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, a Washington, D.C.-based independent policy think tank, and as well as a fellow at Verve Research. And virtually joining us today is Mr. Don Pathan, Regional News Editor of The Nation, who also joined the Asia Foundation 3 years ago as a Senior Program Officer for Regional Cooperation and has spent the past 3 decades covering diplomacy, international relations, and insurgency in Southeast Asia. Thank you to all of our panelists and speakers joining us today and to everyone who's left in the hall. But we want to get straight to the meat of the issue today, and I think we'll start off with Dr. Shashi, who I believe will be able to paint us a picture on how social media is shaping conflicts and wars today. Please.
Excellencies, distinguished officials, ladies and gentlemen, friends from Midas, I'm deeply honored by the invitation to speak. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to divide my talk into 3 parts. A fair amount of what I have to say in the first part will have to do with Ukraine for obvious reasons. Firstly, the military or kinetic aspect, although I should caution I'm not a deep dive expert in terms of military doctrine, but I did want to say a few words. Secondly, social media and disinformation. And thirdly, more generally, what it means for society. And if I have time, maybe a couple of remarks in terms of what I think we can do about it. The first part, I would say that this war has changed how we follow conflict, at least from my neck of the woods. It's particularly thrown into sharp relief the role of open source intelligence, OSINT. The most interesting news to me from this war comes not from official channels. These, of course, should be noted, but for my line of work, it is the dozens of accounts I follow on social media, which are not official accounts, but which convey all manner of news. Street fighting, the horrors of Mariupol, and so on. It's the unofficial, but likely credible citizen journalists, and sometimes soldiers themselves, who give feeds of drone strikes and also news of weapons deployments. We knew some of these were coming from official channels, but the news, the feed, the imagery of the actual use quite often comes, very interestingly, from unofficial sources. In addition to this, we have, of course, investigative news sites. One is Bellingcat, but there are others newer on the scene now, which provide near military-grade reporting in terms of, for example, troop movements. And indeed, to supplement this, ordinary Ukrainians tuning into unencrypted communications and in some cases telling their adversaries to go home and exactly what they thought of them in very colorful language. For all this, my takeaway is that militaries fighting conflicts need to be apprised from here on in and completely situationally aware, not just of the battlefield environment, I think we all knew that, but also the information environment, and they will necessarily have to get better at holistic appreciation of what OSINT can do for them and what it's saying about them. Of course, a similar set of observations applies generally to the information space. Here, I think the war has been marked by Ukraine and President Zelensky's masterful use of narrative, the narrative of struggle, of sacrifice, and I see little to dispute or countermand the idea that whoever wins on the battlefield, the information war at present sees Ukraine in a comfortably superior position. Here I'm moving on to my second point. As important as the question of Ukraine's continued survival is, there are important and critical things going on in the information space. Information telegraphed on various channels, including social media, in a way which can support or otherwise undermine national positions. So, across March 2nd and March 3rd, there were major pro-invasion hashtags on social media, in particular Twitter, across a number of locations in the world. One of them was, as you may know, hashtag I stand with Putin. Another was I stand with Russia. Many of these were created on the day of Russia's invasion, and the accounts were behaving in retweet clusters, implying overlapping activity. These were virtually non-existent before the invasion. So the sharp increases of activity that I'm talking about occurred on the day of or just following the emergency session of the UNGA, the vote to condemn the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. This is an emerging area, but I would say some of the research that has come out in public suggests that some of the activity associated with what I've just mentioned is inauthentic. To its credit, Twitter and some of the other platforms removed a number of these accounts for coordinated inauthentic behavior. The most credible research that I've seen suggests that bot accounts and engagement farming have been used to drive engagement. And this matters, it matters to us in this region because, and of course, this is public, you can find this, some of the accounts have been messaging in Asian and indeed Southeast Asian languages. It's very early days yet, but this in part represents, to me at least, targeted attempts to stir mass opinion in our part of the world. To be clear, these studies do also show other things. They show organic interaction, not fake. And in some cases, this is maybe representative of possibly genuinely held belief by genuine individuals. I'll circle back to this point. Here I want to say that where there's an official narrative by the state uses various means to convince its internal constituency first and foremost, but also countries aligned to it, or countries which may be sympathetic to parts of this narrative, will start to give off similar messages and to shape similar messages in the information space in similar ways. Consider, for example, how Chinese state-backed media followed many of the Kremlin's original points. Some of this is internal, but there's a leaked memo which you can find from the Cyberspace Administration of China. It's a directive which instructs major Chinese platforms and online news portals on how to regulate information concerning the war in Ukraine. And I think this is managing and controlling a domestic audience. Furthermore, according to some observers, the PRC's efforts in this information space reach beyond China's borders. I don't have time to get through all of these examples, but in official sources and then leaking out through social media, you see narratives which claim, for example, amplified claims on neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and also what begins as official messaging, sources like the Global Times and so on, talking about biolabs in Ukraine. So overall, it's clear that there's something going on which more or less is in alignment with the overall Kremlin information narrative. Some of these very same narratives have crystallized in social media and irradiate outwards. I'm turning now to my third point. Some of the themes that we see on social media in Asia, and including Southeast Asia, have, and I'll list some of them, pro-Russia content, strongman imagery of Putin, and favorable comparisons of this strongman against other leaders. Within this, there's also some anti-Western imagery, sentiment, rhetoric, mediated through the lens of various things, including historical colonial experiences. And there are still other strands. For example, and I'll give you one argument, what does Ukraine have to do with us? Another narrative, why do we have to take such a strong line? Now, this is especially present, I think, in the Singapore social media sphere, where the government and key leaders have given a principal position which was expounded in the first session by Minister for Defense, Dr. Ng Eng Hen. And also, if you like further examples, the strong streak of whataboutism. What about this? What about that? What about the US invasion of Iraq? What about Palestine? I'm not dismissing these concerns. I'm not saying they are false. Not for a moment am I saying that. But there's a strong streak of referring back to other historical incidents to deflect the main issue. In Singapore, there are voices in the country supporting Russia in society and supporting on social media. On social media, quite a few are clearly bots, newly created on various platforms, including on TikTok. In fact, in particular on TikTok, dedicated solely to this purpose. And they tend to emphasize, again, just one example of many, the strength of Russia's army, as well as the weaknesses of Singapore's army. And they kind of hint or intimate that doing these actions against Russia is useless or not very good as an idea. Perhaps this has occasioned some surprise on the part of observers, but to me, what is surprising is the level of polarization, segmentization within societies directly related to social media that this invasion has caused, not just in Singapore, but other parts of Southeast Asia. I think we need to be clear on this. Some of the narratives are fed, as I said earlier, by inauthentic activity across platforms with some degree of orchestration behind them. Now, of course, we can have a long discussion about the nature, the makeup, and origins of the activity on platforms ranging from TikTok to Telegram to Instagram. These, of course, need to be investigated further. Still early days. But I want to make two observations here. One is the influence and representative nature of these social media activities can be and is often exaggerated. It may not reflect all of society. I think we should bear that in mind. Secondly, it is reflective of some societal strands of thinking which are deep-rooted, cultural, historical, and which represent genuine belief. And so on have been known for some time, but we kind of forgot these things. So on a certain level, what I want to say is that while we should be concerned about bots, inauthentic activity orchestration, we should not be so surprised on another level, and we should be prepared to look sociologically at the actual roots of mass polarization and sentiment. That still leaves the issue of what to do. I don't have time for a deep excursus, but let me leave you with some thoughts. Firstly, conflicts far afield are increasingly going to polarize domestic opinion, even in nations which you might think have no direct connection to the conflict. Within this, everyone has the right to high-quality information. There has to be an active human or governmental agency, not just an algorithmic agency on the part of the platforms, to provide for this high-quality information. When you have this agency, it may be laws, for example. These are by their very nature potentially problematic. You can have accusations of bias, accusations of using laws for political ends, fundamental issues, for example, whose truth are you talking about? These can plague us, they will. We should recognize that when it comes to the information or influence game, while you may well need laws or legal moves, we should bear in mind also that actors have over time developed the ability to watch these moves and to mask their tracks further and to cultivate opinions which seem innocuous or which may be at a level which technically can evade legal thresholds. This is something that needs to be watched out for. So yes, platforms have obligations. I'm not saying that they don't. But there are other things that we can and should be doing. One of the things which has not been mentioned, but which is a good initiative, is the ASEAN ADMM Cybersecurity and Info Center of Excellence, which is a good step. It's been set up. It will be based in Singapore, and I have no doubt this will provide a platform and a venue for mutually beneficial comparing of notes. The bottom line is that in our common striving to keep the information environment healthy, the set of initiatives that we try has to go beyond the regulatory, beyond pressuring platforms, and I suspect will need to reach deep inside the levels of various parts of society. And I think, given the audience that we have here, maybe you would agree that across East and West, and indeed across hemispheres, we can agree on this. There are commonalities when I look at pre-bunking or debunking, age-old things like reinforcing fact-checking and authentic journalism, age-old things, and some call these heritage skills, things that we used to have at one time in an earlier age. The future may well bring with it evolutions in this and in critical thinking, which if done right, and I'm sure you will agree, has to start from a very, very young age. So the key is, how do you get, in an unartificial way, polarized segments of society to trust responsible and trusted sources of information, even when there are continued disagreements in society, which is natural, but not allowing these disagreements to play out in a way which frays or tears at the basic fabric of society. And I think, as I would say as a Singaporean, this is especially important in multicultural societies. Well, that's a subject for another discussion, but I would hazard in closing that if progress is to be made, we will have to have future occasions and venues like this one to compare notes across continents and hemispheres. This is how we realize that the issues that we face are not that much different, and I suspect the solutions too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shashi. I think there were many interesting ideas there, particularly looking at polarized segments of society, popular sentiments on social media, especially with Ukraine recently. But before we get to questions, I want to move on to the next speaker. I'd like to invite Ms. Munirah Mustaffa onto the podium.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. So I'll be approaching information warfare from the intelligence practitioner's perspective. So our conversation today is going to center on a big topic with a multitude of layers to talk about, and I will do my best to try and keep it short. So what we understand about intelligence in the traditional sense is that intelligence and analysis play a key role to feed and inform policymakers in the process of making the right decision and to avoid strategic surprises, or at worst, unwanted outcomes. And good intel, as we know it, can assess probable outcomes of proposed policy options to identify the risks, and we know that this is important for national security, defense, and foreign policy. Now, I want to talk about open source intelligence, which is why I'm here today. The topic highlights social media shift, but open source intelligence is a large part of that shift, or balance of power, if you prefer. I think that there has been this strong misconception that the value of OSINT is not as significant as the more so-called covert types of intelligence, like human informant, signals, etc. Now, this misapprehensions with regards to OSINT is largely because it is not considered to be as credible as intelligence that are collected from what's considered to be traditional, closed source, and sometimes they are treated as a narrative. And this is the wrong attitude to have, because like it or not, OSINT is just as important, just as credible, and just as valuable in telling us about, to borrow Donald Rumsfeld's words, to know the known knowns and the known unknowns that exist within the threat environment. The caveat is, of course, it lies in our capabilities to verify those estimates. And now, with the proliferation of social media platforms with millions of users across the cyberspace, the new digital reality can be overwhelming, not only for companies in the private sector looking to protect their brand and reputation, but equally for governments and militaries wanting to protect their assets and national security. Now, this is further complicated by threat actors who carry out coordinated and deliberate attacks, such as disinformation, to erode public trust in governance, or hacking to gain access to private and confidential data, either for political reasons or profit. Now, beyond that, intelligence gathering and analysis is now no longer a capability that's exclusive to governments and private sectors, but now any regular person with a computer and a few simple techniques can conduct their own inquiries or investigations just by using online tools to trawl through search engines and social media. Now, Bellingcat is a good example of how independent and regular citizens can leverage their access to information to assist them in their investigations. As we all know, Bellingcat, which was founded by Elliot Higgins, had investigated the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war back in 2011 against civilians by collecting and analyzing video footage uploaded by local sources. Now, their investigations have also been proven to be valuable to be submitted as evidence in the inquiry in the shooting down of MH17 by Russia-backed separatists. The current ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict also makes a strong case study of how OSINT has been valuable in providing situational updates to those entrenched in the battlefield and also to online observers, intelligence analysts, both government and private, and journalists who are keeping track of the war as it unfolds in real time, harnessing the hive mind. OSINT has also been a great tool for human rights watchers to track and identify abuses or war crimes. Also, the United States and Britain had, in unprecedented fashion, publicized their intelligence on Russia's invasion plans as part of a last-ditch diplomacy effort and strategy for deterrence, now referred to as pre-bunking. But while the information environment has been a powerful tool in our arsenal in the security industry, we must not forget its limitations. One of those most overlooked pitfalls of OSINT, collected from social media, is the fog of war. Due to the speed and volume at which information is being pumped out, it can be very overwhelming for those who are collecting information for analysis, even for the most seasoned analysts or experienced investigators. Now, we all here understood the assignment that good intelligence has to be timely, which means the intelligence consumers, our bosses, would want to have their situational briefings along with their morning coffee. But navigating through that fog of war can be a challenging and complex process, especially when that information environment also contains threat actors, especially when threat actors who would push falsehoods and promote disinformation to contaminate information and taint intelligence. Now, to borrow Ben Nemo's concept of the 4Ds, they aim to dismiss, distort, distract, and dismay us. So this is where we need to try be more measured and cautious with our estimates. But that's not the only step. We also need to develop our abilities to detect instances of disinformation, misinformation, and social media manipulation, as well as track other types of online harm. So as we navigate through complex issues, we also need to start thinking about this new challenge in a more realistic way and holistic as well. Fact-checking alone is not enough. It's not enough at all. We need to completely change our attitude in the way we receive information and the way we proactively counter disinformation. All-level reluctance to encourage critical thinking and assessing information and news more critically is a perennial problem. That would also require confronting and challenging our own preconceived and confirmation biases. We need to be more aware of our own biases because that can skew our analysis and affect our judgment. Now, I'm saying this not only for the benefit of those in the NetSec communities, but given the evolving intelligence landscape in the era of falsehoods, we also need to think about how we should communicate our decisions with regards to security to our stakeholders. And that can include the public too, in order to build their resilience and earn their trust, while protecting them from malign influence campaigns at the same time. On our part, this will require developing our capabilities to be able to identify a threat early on in the form of information warfare and counter it by increasing public resiliency. Preempting and dealing with the consequences of disinformation needs a holistic approach, and that can also involve triaging and a social contract with informed citizens who are aware of the threat. We just have to accept that the challenge is an ongoing process and focus on mitigating the risks. I am optimistic we will continue to see progress, that we will continue to see solutions proposed and implemented. However, we must not place the burden on the social media users alone, but instead, we must try integrate that into policy as part of resiliency plan to protect the people from sophisticated information operation that seeks to demoralize them. This is one of the many actionable strategies that we can formulate to modernize our approach to consuming media and make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think Munirah moved slightly away from social media, but still looking at the process of gathering information, gathering data that is, as you said, no longer exclusive to governments, looking at a much more horizontal manner of spreading information. But I think similarly to what Dr. Shashi mentioned as well, changing our attitude in the way we receive news, receive information with a lot more critical thinking, but I think that's easier said than done. But, you know, we'll unpack that later on. I want to get to our final panelist of the day. Joining us virtually is Mr. Don Pathan from The Nation. I would like to invite Mr. Don Pathan to start his presentation. Are you able to see us, by the way?
Yes, I can. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Please
I left The Nation some time ago, about almost 10 years ago, but I was still continuing to write for them and other publications, working as freelance. But I joined the media in the mid-90s. Back then, I remembered what we called news cycle, meaning that, the news would come out, the newspaper will come out once every 24 hours. And that during that 24 hours news cycle, politician, policymaker, or sources will have plenty of time to go over, to rephrase, to rethink their approach, their answers, so on. Fast forward a little bit to 2000 or late 2000. In Afghanistan, I was there covering the war 20 years ago. I remembered one article, 1,000 word, I could get about 1,000 US from an international magazine. That same article today, I can probably get no more than $300. So that says something about how internet affected the mainstream media, the competition, the proliferation of the various outlets. Fast forward to today, I guess I could say that having seen that transition over the past 30 years, I would say, well, on the surface, it reduced the cost of communication. We talk about social media and increased the speed of dissemination of information. Like I said, internet as a whole, it really hurt, it forced my industry to change. And that's part of the reason why I left and started doing consultancy. And now, 3 years ago, I joined the Asia Foundation. It's a development organization, but one of my jobs is to work on the Far South, the conflict insurgency in Thailand's Far South. It's an ethno-nationalist conflict. 7,000 people have died already since January 2004. The media, the social media is a platform where, both the mainstream media and the so-called, social media comes together, or social media meaning that has not been vetted yet. This doesn't mean that mainstream media is that much better. In Thailand's case, people often ask me, it's the media. What's the role of the media in this conflict? Is it helping? I would say no. I would argue that it's part of the problem. And why is that? Partly because mainly it's because it's the narrative that it embraces is still very state-constructed, state-centric. Even the reporting is still very Bangkok-centric, meaning the news editors in Bangkok decide what's news, what's not news. The bigger the death, the bigger the attack, the bigger the headline. So in other words, the conflict is still being treated as, not a conflict, but as more of a crime story, when it comes to the Ukraine, let me say something in a Thai context. One of the things I noticed is that there's a lot of the conservative here, royalist / conservative element in Thailand are embracing this a very anti-democracy, without calling it that, by embracing a lot of the pro-Russia narrative, like Dr. Shashi was saying earlier. questions being raised in his country about, why this, why that, why would we have to care, But the conservative here have not been very happy with the Western countries preaching or criticizing the lack of democracy or the liberal democracy. And after all, we had 2 coups in the past 10 years, right? So anyway, social media and mainstream is still very critical, but you have the conservative media like the mainstream one, like the TV5, which is owned by the Thai army. This week, they're in the process of negotiating with China, Iran, and Russia for inputs, for content sharing. Actually, it's not really sharing; it's more like one-way freebies. Today, like I said earlier, social media, easy access, quick to spread the disinformation. It's not just the public. You have what we call I/O, information operation, which is, I guess, a sort of counterintelligence, counterinsurgency by a secretive unit within the Thai army. Is doing that to discredit the critics and also the rebels in the far south. If you look at the mainstream media, if you do a content analysis of the Thai mainstream media, you could also come up with that same conclusion that it's not very balanced, not balanced at all. Part of that is because the rebel, the Barisan Revolutionaries Nasional, doesn't have any identifiable political wing or a spokesman, somebody who could engage the public. And so, but then again, more effort could be taken to balance the story. And that's a problem here, How the public use social media, after all, counterinsurgency or insurgency in general is a communicative action. You hit something to send to make a political statement. So it's the statement does not necessarily come out in the form of IED, roadside bombings or gunfight or attacking, soft target, but it also come out in social media. You look, for example, the funerals of the insurgents. They're getting bigger, they're getting louder. This in itself is also a statement to the security apparatus that saying that your efforts to win hearts and minds, your counterinsurgency operation is not doing its job. We're not giving in, that kind of message. So I'll leave it at that and turn the floor to the moderator.
Okay, thank you so much. Also a lot to unpack there. I have a few questions myself. We will get to the Q&A session. So if you have questions, there are microphones around the hall. I think there are a lot of interesting ideas here, but I think before we get to the floor, I do have one question myself. I want to go back to Munirah. A lot of interesting ideas there and, just a lot of different perspectives from across the region. But you mentioned that you're rather optimistic about where things are headed, about the future, how things will progress in the context of you were speaking about open source intelligence and about how society's perception or reception towards information and news right now that's so rapidly shared. Why exactly are you optimistic and what can you say about what's to come? I mean, we're looking at, again, I want to go back to Ukraine, how things are unraveling so quickly on social media, and with the spread of misinformation. What exactly are you optimistic about and why?
Sure. So I'm optimistic because we are now learning that technology is changing at a very frenetic pace. And we are having a growing community that's learning to recognize the risks. And now we are also recognizing that those risks are being distributed across the spectrum. So there now no longer that the risk management is only focused at government and at public sector, but also there are individuals who are forming their own collective and are galvanizing themselves to counter this threat. So I think that we're going to see a future where the action It's not just from the higher level, but also from the grassroots level as well. I mean, if we consider Bellingcat as an example, that's how it started as well.
Dr. Shashi, I would like to perhaps get your reaction. Are you just as optimistic or maybe a little bit pessimistic about where things are headed?
I think Munirah has CT counter-terror experience. I have some as well. I used to work in the Ministry of Defense, examining a variety of issues as an analyst, but including on CT and radicalization issues. Of course, when it comes to the disinformation bubbles, we may be talking about something which is quite different. But I remember around 2007 being struck by what turned out to be the first of Singapore's self-radicalized cases. Before that, it was all groups, like the JI and so on. And that person, and there have been many since, inhabited a series of conceptual echo chambers and filter bubbles, which to all intents and purposes may not be the same where people polarized by disinformation bubbles are, but conceptually there are many similarities as well. So you take a leaf from the CT radicalization field, it's very, very hard to deprogram them out of their conceptual echo chambers. Singapore has a model involving religious scholars, but what strikes me, at least for the Singapore context, actually in other locations as well, is that once the self-radicalizing influence from social media, because it's all social media, comes in, those people, those scholars, start to be somewhat less useful, I think I can say. And any online counter-narrative which has been tried, you see what I'm getting at here, for the radicalized cases, but also fast forward for people under the influence of algorithms, troll farms, and so on and so forth, it tends not to be so effective. And I repeat something I've said elsewhere in other contexts for radicalization, and also people like what we're talking about now. I've not seen any online counter-narrative work. It's very, very intensive, face-to-face. I think Munirah mentioned triage, agencies getting together, devoting resources to understand one person's mindset. And when you, again, for both, when you come across something which seems to be successful at the individual level, you rapidly find that it can't be scaled up at a societal level for whatever reason. I think more investigation is needed, but you think you have the secret sauce, then you go on to the next person who's under the influence, so to speak, who seems to be a carbon copy, same background, makeup, social media profile, same background in terms of upbringing, and it doesn't work for the second guy, but it worked for the first. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's returning back to old school skills, the heritage skills I talked about, from young, critical thinking, upbringing, family, kin group, reading like we used to read, the pages, not just dipping into it. And I think people, societies like that, and there are very few, which inculcate this from a very, very young age, have an automatic head start, and they can be on the way to being called really resilient societies. Many societies take that term and bandy it around, but very few really are. So somewhat less sanguine than Munirah, at the risk of disagreeing.
Thank you. And lastly, I'd like to hear from Mr. Pathan as well. I don't know if it's fair to describe this as a chicken versus egg situation, but Mr. Pathan, do you think polarized narratives stem from social media, new forms of media, or does social media just exacerbate these polarized segments of society with these polarized narratives rooted in society beyond social media?
That's a tough one. Well, from what I see is that it's an ongoing thing. It's something that state official, activists, people, stakeholders can't relax. You know, you can't have your guard down. You constantly have to be aware of you know, what this hate speech, hate crime, or messaging is coming from, and what to do about it. You know, I agree with Dr. Shashi about you know, the person to person, the P2P. You know, I look at the recruitment in the Far South, for example, and how they recruiting to join the combatant group. It's very much, you know, P2P. But then again, the social media comes in when they need to target the larger audience. The general public, and both sides does it, not just the state, but also the rebels in that respect, so, you can't replace that P2P, that people to people, because when they sit down and start doing recruitment, from what I observed, the narrative is very powerful and very strong, and you need that individual to get that across, to win that hearts and mind over. So.
Right, thank you. That's from me, but we do want to hear some questions from the floor. I think, yes, we have several hands there, but I think we see a gentleman right at the microphone stand. We'll get to the other questions later on. If you can introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, Moderator. I am Lieutenant Commander Shif from Malaysian Armed Forces Staff College. My question is to the entire panel, and this is regarding the how does right to free speech in the form of social media posts and opinion sharing impinge on the national security both domestically and internationally if it goes against the national narratives? And the following part of the question is, do you think governments can be within their rights to vet or impose restrictions on the content sharing which can be shared in interest of genuine national interests? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Shashi, would you be able to answer that? Because I think you mentioned a little bit about regulatory frameworks.
Yeah, that's
going beyond
a huge question. Thanks for giving me all the difficult questions. Appreciate that. Maybe I draw on the Singapore experience, and then if you like, we can expand outwards from that. I can't speak from a Singapore government perspective. I'm not government anymore, but maybe more of an informed perspective, because my think tank works very closely with government stakeholders. I don't think the thinking current in Singapore at the establishment level is that the social media companies, the platforms, messaging platforms, have this untrammeled right to say what they want to say. It may well have been the premise at the very beginning, and I think the attitude of the social media companies was like that for a considerable amount of time. And things began to change in the Singapore scene, I think roughly maybe 2016, around the time of Trump's election, because very quickly following on then, there was all this talk, followed by studies, credible reporting about Cambridge Analytica, Russian attempts to see, firstly, polarization in the United States, and also to possibly influence the election result. Very quickly in 2018, you had a Singapore Parliamentary Select Committee examining the issue of deliberate online falsehoods, and this came out with a major report, which is online, you can find it, where, and I testified, a number of my colleagues testified, where it rapidly became clear that a suite or panoply of issues looking to deal with this matter had to be rolled out. Legislation is one. So we now have POFMA, which is the acronym for the Singapore Fake News Law. You can also find that online and the provisions. But it was clear, this sometimes tends to be forgotten, that what was equally emphasized in the report was all these non-legislative measures as well. Cyber hygiene, social media literacy, shoring up young people's critical thinking skills, promoting fact-checking, which need not necessarily be government initiatives. By the way, by way of more directly trying to answer your question, it is worth looking up on YouTube and elsewhere the actual seminal exchanges that took place between the key government ministers, I'm thinking of the then and present Law Minister, Minister Shanmugam, and the social media platforms during the course of the March 2018 exchanges. Because this really, it was bruising, at least for the social media companies, where they were trying to some degree to highlight the point that has just been made, that they have a right to connect people. It's their mission. And certainly from the Singapore point of view, I think this was never accepted. And certainly from that point of view, from that point on, the sense that, oh, if you take that point of view, okay, so you can't police yourself. You refuse to police yourself adequately. This is not just Facebook, various platforms. Therefore, the strong arm of the law needs to come in a regulatory way, because you, the platforms, are basically trying to monetize ad revenue. The algorithms based on this feed polarization. You make the money, but the various societies, including societies which are delicate, multicultural, can be prone to polarization if the right levers are applied, get to pick up the pieces, get to suffer. And I think this is the feeling from Singapore and various other diverse, polyglot, multicultural countries where we can't take tolerance for granted. I'm not sure if Munirah would like to add to that.
So I consider myself to be a practical person, and I like things that are actionable. So when we talk about free speech, I'm all for free speech, it's great, but we need to learn to recognize that it has its limitations. And we should try to recognize that the directionality of the vectors as well in terms of free speech. We can't have people creating harm to other people as well. So this is where we need to ascertain that boundaries, and that's important. So when it comes to online harm and also information, what's important is that when we look at the threat, we also need to learn and recognize the intention, because that's the difference between misinformation and disinformation. For example, disinformation is a deliberate coordinated falsehoods with the intent to malign a community. But misinformation is more or less without the intent to harm. It's just accidental, more or less. So I think that's the kind of approach that we need to distinguish, and also that would involve a lot of legalities as well.
Thank you. I want to move on to the next question because I saw a lot of hands being raised. Yeah, I think we'll start with the gentleman to my left.
Good afternoon, Moderator.
I believe your microphone is not switched on. Can we get some help with that?
Testing 1, 2. All right. Thank you, Moderator. Good afternoon to all. I am Kena Razi from the National Brazilian College, Puspahanas. First and foremost, I would like to thank to all the speakers for sharing your thoughts on the topic this afternoon. So my question is that still within the issues on the Russian and Ukraine conflict. So the conflict have been dominating the social media with many critical, analytical, and abusive comments. So how can the social media platform play the role of a mediator in this type of intense and hostile debate? Thank you very much.
Could Ms. Munirah help shed some light? I believe he was speaking about using social media as a platform to mediate. Correct? Would you like some more context to that? I believe you were talking about in the context of a conflict, how to perhaps mediate through social media?
You mean the exchange of information on social media with regards to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and then there's the whole sharing of intelligence online, right? I think that's a kind of reality that we have to accept. It's going to be the new normal, and it's going to be here to stay. And this is where it gets a bit tricky, because this is part of the PPP, public-private partnership thing comes in, and also the responsibility of the social media companies as well. But the nitty-gritty part is that we need to try, I mean, what they should consider is that, like, there's this exchange of intelligence online, but you can't be picking sides, although right now they are picking sides. But realistically, I mean, even if we take this conflict out of the equation, how do we determine what's fair for both sides? And I don't think it's a good practice to clamp down on intelligence exchange online, because I think that, to be honest, for my part, I think it's great that we have so much access. And access to information is important because people need to have access and knowledge. But what's crucial is that they must have access to correct information at the most in a timely manner. And right now, what our concern is that the exchange of intelligence online, right? I mean, that's unavoidable. However, with that said, that also boils down to how people perceive that information and process that into actionable intelligence as well. So good luck to whichever side of, in the battlefield at how efficient they can utilize that information and process them into actionable intelligence. That With that said, this is going to be the new digital reality that we're going to be seeing in the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Munirah. Do you have something to add?
Thanks. It was a great question. I think to some degree, the major platforms have already taken a stand, and taken a stand in a way where it's difficult for them to cast themselves neutral if they have come up to various degrees, as they have, to suggest that what's happened is an illegal invasion of a sovereign country, which is against the norms of international law. But that said, there are certain things which they can, and to be fair, should be doing, and they are. One is to take down coordinated inauthentic activity, internet brigades, orchestrated attempts to stir mass opinion. I think Facebook has been not bad in this respect. Platforms like TikTok, quite frankly, in my view, somewhat less so. And I say this because my country is in the course of being affected by some of this clearly bot-controlled, inauthentic activity. But that's the inauthentic activity. In terms of the traffic and the news that passes through these social media platforms, you've also got ordinary news sources and citizen journalism reporting on the actual course and progress of the war. And here I think, I'm not in a position to give the platforms advice, but I think they need to be very careful, because you may very well get the sense from going through the feeds, and we may well be following the same accounts on Twitter and so on, that Ukraine is about to topple Russia as a military power, about to boot out the invaders from the country. That may be true. It may well not be true if you follow a slightly different set of accounts. So even though the major platforms like Meta been designated, I believe, a terrorist organization by the Russian state, even though that is the case, I think it is in their interest, if they want to preserve their credible news reporting chops, that they should report in a fair and even-handed manner. And of course, they are not a traditional news source. It may have to do with the algorithm. It may have to do, as I mentioned earlier, with taking down stuff which is clearly fake or coordinated. And fairness also applies in other ways. Don't hide the ugly truths, as difficult as it may be to stomach, when you come across news which is true or very close to being authenticated. And a good example, if those of you who follow this, you may have seen in the last 24 hours, Ukrainian troops who have captured a number of Russian POWs. The POWs are already wounded. How so? The clip doesn't show. They're interrogated, mostly in Russian. But towards the end of the clip, clearly it shows some of these Russian POWs having their legs shot. So I'm not saying it's a good thing or bad thing. I don't want to come down either way in terms of whether the platform should or should not have carried it. But put it this way, they have not really had that many compunctions in showing authenticated videos of Russian military atrocities. So, sense of fairness.
Thanks. Mr. Pathan, would you like to add to that, looking at these risks?
Yeah, I mean, the question was what can social media play that mediation role, in conflict. In my experience covering, conflict in Southeast Asia, in the mainland Southeast Asia, in the age of social media. I mean, I see social media as helping, in some way helping, making the atmosphere conducive for peace, put it that way, by promoting certain information about, what constitutes war crime, what is rules of engagement, what are international norms or humanitarian principles that need to be embraced, that kind of discussions. I think a lot of people are online in Thailand, especially in the far south, where the conflict is, and I think in a way it forces people to be more careful, and instead of just saying anything, or what we're seeing coming out of Ukraine, so that's that. But as a media itself, I think you still need to, sit down face to face, no microphone, no recording, that kind of thing, and it's still very old-fashioned. Mediation is still, you still need that, but doesn't mean that the social media can't help. And I think when violation is committed, when people are quick to point that out. For example, I'll give you one quick example. Back in 2006, over 100 schools were burned down in the far south. The following year, less than 10. And it wasn't really social media, but it was that, again, exact communication, a tea shop, and criticism from the local people against the rebel who they supported, you know. And the following years, that number from 140 schools to less than 10, you know. So, and imagine if this tea shop in the village becomes, you know, Facebook, Twitter, or whatever, you know. So I see that as amplifying, you know. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Different perspectives, different experiences, but I think everyone's rather cautious.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want to add one more point. We want social media to be neutral, but the problem with social media being neutral is that algorithm is not neutral, and that's the key risk that we have to acknowledge. And I think what's practical in trying to mitigate that risk is that we have to be certain about our position. And the problem with that, even if we want social media to remain neutral, and in the current conflict where they're trying to sanction Russia, for instance, and that's also comes with the pros and cons in the calculus, because we have to also consider that there are people who are not entirely consenting to the conflict are being hit as well, and that's the kind of risk that we need to consider as well.
Thank you. Indeed, algorithm is not neutral, the bitter truth of today's digital age. Let's move on to the next question from the floor. Yes, the gentleman in the back. Go ahead.
Assalamualaikum and good afternoon. Captain Fairuz from Malaysian Armed Forces Defence College. I have a question. I welcome feedback or comments from the respective speakers. The paradox of social media, the world is virtual, but the threat is real. This is going to dominate the domain of future warfare, as it requires huge effort to validate or verify the authenticity of the information. Do you agree that the social media have been weaponized, since it has been effective means to create, instill, and manipulate fear towards the adversaries, publics, or the community? Thank you.
Thank you. Weaponizing social media to instill fear. I think, like to Dr. Shashi, we're speaking about authenticating.
Yeah, thanks. I think all of us will probably have something useful to say on this. I just want to be clear, I understand the question. Do we agree that social media has been weaponized to instill fear in the populace? Yeah. Well, yes, and of course this takes place not just in a time of warfare. And those of us who study hybrid, so-called Gerasimov doctrine, which is really not a doctrine, and informational compromise, will realize that the really interesting stuff in some ways takes place long before the actual declaration of hostilities, and sometimes there isn't one. So the trick is for target or adversary societies, including sometimes Singapore, to steal or undergird the resilience of their own populations, which can be multicultural, polyglot, in ways which sometimes have very little to do with social media. So there have been strides made within Singapore at looking at social media hygiene, digital literacy in schools. And separately, our defense minister did not mention this just now, so I'll mention it. The national servicemen, because we have national service in Singapore, specific programs to build up the digital and social media hygiene there. And finally, some effort to incorporate digital within the total defense concept that we have. And this is major because this was the first time it had happened, a first update of the total defense concept in about 25 years. So when the word by the questioner is used, weaponization, I think we need to be very, very careful. It comes up against the defenses that I just mentioned. But we need to be aware, even though most of you here in the audience are military people, that some of the action, the really interesting stuff, takes place from the point of view of the adversary to undermine the will to resist on the part of the target country. And speaking frankly, I'll say this because it's all out in the public domain anyway. At one point in time, not that long ago, about 6 years ago, when Beijing, China was very, very annoyed in Singapore for a whole variety of issues. And of course, there was actual action that was part of this retaliatory response. The detaining of Singapore's APCs, Terexes in Hong Kong was one. But the point I want to make here is that some of the adversarial retaliatory narrative spun out from social media had its origins, from my point of view, on the Chinese social media sphere, Weibo, WeChat, and so on. But then it transmutes itself across languages into the Singapore social media sphere. And it becomes, quite apart from the issue of bots and orchestration, which we can have a long discussion about, but it becomes sophisticated and tugs at Singaporeans' loyalties and heartstrings as well. Why are you opposing Beijing? Beijing is going to be strong, maybe the eventual winner in South China Sea. Why are you doing this? Why do you not support our view on South China Sea? By the way, your, meaning Singaporean, your leadership is a complete disappointment not to understand China. And it goes on and on. You are a Chinese country. Of course, we're not. But so the adversarial narratives are extremely sophisticated, and I would argue have even more room to play and wiggle room in times of peace, that gray area, which we will never become, and with China, I hope we will never become kinetic.
Munirah, do you have any thoughts on this? Perhaps from a Malaysian experience, because we're hearing a lot about Singapore. Weaponizing is a rather strong word. What are your thoughts?
Well, like it or not, social media manipulation is an existing threat, and it's going to stay. What we can do is to mitigate that problem, mitigate the risks. Now, human behavior has always been the same. The only thing that's changed is just technology, and the only reason why we're feeling its impact more now because of social media. Now, threat actors, why they're doing this is because they're doing it for a purpose, either to achieve a political goal or a financial goal or anything like that. And what we have to remember is that it doesn't just boil down to state actors, but it can also be non-state actors. And it can be coordinated and targeted. And the aim is to try change in behavior or influence their thinking. Now, I think the closest example of that would be COVID-19, for instance, where we have this coordinated network trying to influence the population's opinion on vaccine, for instance, and they're trying to influence them to not take the vaccine. For what purpose? It could be for various reasons. Again, it could be for political reason, or it could be religious reason, or it could be for financial reasons, because they're intending to try to offer an alternative solution to the medication as well, to the vaccine as well. So all I'm saying is that I know that the word weaponization is a strong word. When I first heard weaponization, even I was not comfortable. But this is the new reality that we're living in today, and we have to learn to navigate and identify those problems, those threats that comes along with these complex issues. And the best thing we can do is we just need to learn to roll with it and learn to detect the threats and try to mitigate. We can't afford to be, we can't afford to put out the fire after it happened. We have to prevent the fire before it starts.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, so we have a gentleman in the back with a question.
My name is Lieutenant Commander Shahryar from Malaysian Armed Forces Staff College. My question to the panel is, Twitter and WhatsApp are very powerful tools. For Twitter, owing to retweets, the originator of content disappears. Similarly, for WhatsApp, it's very difficult to trace the content back to originator. So don't you think in order to aid law enforcement agencies in tracing the source of false news or fake news, Twitter or WhatsApp, these groups should be pursued to add a provision wherein the originator's name or ID is watermarked on the picture or video. Same will preserve the originality of the content and at the same time aid the law enforcement agencies. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pathan, looking at the role of law enforcement agencies in curbing, safeguarding social media platforms, I think the question specifically looked at Twitter and WhatsApp. and particularly at information being spread where there are no specific sources. What do you think?
In Thailand, the state actor is part of the problem, and like I said earlier in my introduction, briefly, there's a group called what we call IO, Information Operation, to describe the work of so government agencies under the army behind these misinformation to discredit the critics. Keep in mind that we have ongoing political crisis that seems never ending. Anyway, so when the government, the law enforcement agency, or the government, the military that controls the power, it's been accused in the parliament. At the last no confidence debate, it was exposed. To the point of how much they were getting. So it's really hard to come up with an argument to say that we need to support our law agencies, our government, that kind of thing. When we're in this kind of situation, this political crisis. In the normal times, maybe, I would seriously have to think about that. But from my profession, whole profession, I'm shaped by the idea of free press, free and responsible press. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, when you say state actors are part of the problem, that just unfolds an entirely different problem, an entirely new conversation, right? I do want to get Munirah's perspective on this, because you, before this, repeatedly stressed the need for bottom-up structures of, safeguarding and protecting information dissemination. So looking at the role of law enforcement agencies is really not as simple as we might think, and as well as looking at Twitter and WhatsApp. I think in Malaysia, WhatsApp particularly poses a huge problem of identifying fake news where there are no specific sources. Your thoughts on this?
I don't agree that we can't detect it. Actually, we can. I believe in forensic sciences. So what you're talking about is actually attributions and lawful access. So there are two different things. So the thing about all these falsehoods, they have to come from somewhere. And I don't agree. I mean, I think that it would be a mistake to think that we can't trace them. Actually, we can. We already have the capabilities. They're evolving as we speak. They're being developed as we speak. And the talent, the skill needed to do this kind of analysis is growing as we speak as well. So you can identify them. We just need to trace a source. It just allows the visualization of the network, and we can we can attribute a source, even though the information is overwhelming. But that's, again, to do that, we need to be more proactive. And again, as I said before, we need to try and be more agile and more alert in recognizing the threat, because that's when we can mitigate it from the start before it spreads.
Saw you grab your mic. I believe you want to add to that.
Thanks. That's an interesting one. The gentleman who asked the question, may I ask, is from which country? From Malaysia?
From Pakistan.
Pakistan. Thanks, sir. See, I recognize where the question comes from, and I apologize, you're from Pakistan, but I thought originally you might be from India, and let me explain, because some of the restrictions that were brought out by the social media platforms, or which governments tried to impose on the platforms following a spate of different kinds of incidents, lynchings, rumor mongerings, child abductions, and so on and so forth. So some of this directly led, if my understanding is correct, WhatsApp, for example, to initially roll out its forwarding limits, which have since spread to other jurisdictions as well. So my point is there are certain ways and means to do things. It's harder, maybe much harder, if we're talking about an encrypted platform. And regrettably, you said Malaysia. Actually, Singapore WhatsApp is the same. And some of the key news, including with regard to the pro-Ukraine, pro-Russia narrative that we've been talking about in the last few weeks, is on WhatsApp and if I may say, it's on the family WhatsApp group somehow, which is the one WhatsApp group you cannot exit. Correct me if I'm wrong. The Singapore point of view is not been to precisely take up the prescriptions you gave regarding identification of the originator. Might be possible on Twitter, but as far as I understand the laws, and there are two major laws in Singapore. I mentioned one, which is the Singapore Fake News Law, which has been law since 2018, which is called POFMA, that's the acronym. And a much more recent law, which has been rolled out, the acronym is FICA, which is the Foreign Interference and Countermeasures Act. It's an act acting against these troll farms or state actors trying to parlay influence into Singapore society. So I will just briefly range across, because there are different clauses in these laws. Not so much the solution that you sketched out regarding identification of the originator. I suppose that's interesting and possible. But more, across the two laws, a set of clauses, depending on the law, which stipulate that the social media platform, whichever it may be, has, upon request of government, and if the government is concerned, it must fulfill a list of conditions, let's say it strongly suspects a coordinated influence campaign, has to provide technical assistance. So these are called technical assistance directions. So technical information with regard to, in the FICA case, it's not been tested yet, it may well happen, with regard to who's the originator of this account, who's the owner of this account, who are the influencers or the cheerleaders in the wider network. One would surmise, this is from my think tank perspective, I can't speak from government, that the platform, upon request, with justification, will have to provide this information, because they're pretty hefty penalties, even hefty from the rich social media points of view, penalties if the social media company chooses not to comply. So I do not have great many doubts from my personal point of view, given what's been happening, that over time FICA is likely to be used. It may well be wielded away from the public glare, but obviously if the social media companies refuse to comply, this will probably leak out into the public domain. So watch this space.
Thank you. The tools are there, but it really boils down to actors involved being more proactive and being more responsible. We just have about 1 to 2 minutes left, but I do just want to throw this out to the floor. Is there another question that we can go on to before we wrap things up? I believe we got all the questions, or is there one more? Right. I think we're able to squeeze in one more question before we end things today.
Good afternoon. My name is Coordinator Jamwal from the Malaysian Armed Forces Staff College. I think we have spoken enough about how social media is bad. I'll take it to the other side. Yeah, what do you guys think? Yes, social media has pervasive, information is at your fingertips, and information warfare has always been part of a line of operation for any national government and a military operation from way back in the history. But do you think, are we moving and inching way towards state control or censorship?
Sorry, could you repeat that just a little bit?
What I'm saying is that we're talking about controlling, access on social media, what's said through laws, through social cohesion and social programs and digital literacy. But do you think, are we putting control on having giving them an opportunity or a platform to have a healthy discussion, and then states taking that narrative over because it does not suit their perceptions? Over.
It would be great if you could repeat that, but what I got from that was...
I apologize, my hearing is not very...
No, I will probably speak loud. What I'm saying is that, are we going towards more censorship on the social media? Are we that scared of it that we cannot let it have a bit more open and honest discourse on social medias?
That's a different side of the discussion, right? Because we were talking about in the context of war and conflicts, but
Yeah, that's right.
I think that goes back to a little bit about free speech and having social media as a platform for healthy discussion. That's another conversation, but Dr. Shashi, if you'd like to share a little bit about, I guess it goes back to, again, how to ensure social media can be a more responsible and safer platform.
So, thanks for the question. Government ministers in Singapore in the last few years, especially after POFMA during the hearings, have come down pretty hard on social media platforms. My personal view, yes, they have a lot to answer for. But interestingly, even some of the harder line ministers, I'm not going to name their names, even when they have done this, have always or usually left aside 1-2 lines to say, look, we acknowledge that social media platforms have been, to some degree, a force for good in the sense of connecting humanity, creating communities, fashioning like-minded interest groups, and so on and so forth. So if you attempted to take a very, very hard line, I mean, let's say China's Great Firewall, for example. 20 years ago, if someone from China's administration says, we're going to build this firewall, we're going to have the internet, but it's going to be our internet, nothing bad's going to come in. It's like you close the windows, the flies can't go in, right? I think people would have laughed at them. But since then, not only have they shown it's possible, but they've created this reality. But the reality cuts both ways. They are safeguarding, from Beijing's point of view, the domestic constituency and preventing platforms, bad ideas, anti-state propaganda from coming in. Well and good. But the flip side is this is an interesting lesson for various other nations which may well be thinking or contemplating of similar things. And I think we need to be very, very careful when we go down that road. I can speak maybe with more authority for Singapore, which, if you know anything about Singapore, has, despite what you may have heard, a relatively independent press and social media scene, and at an early stage when the internet, early 90s, started to take root in Singapore, I think key decisions were made, not to control in the way that you may later have in other countries. Why? Because our very existence is predicated on an openness to talent, information, and ideas. In particular, the ideas. You shut off the flow of ideas or the platforms which carry them, you're in deep trouble, and the ecosystem generally which underpins Singapore's success collapses anyway. So I'm not sure if this is your question, but it might be more interesting to refashion, and I hope the social media companies are listening, probably not, refashion the good work that they have done to effective countermeasures in terms of taking steps to what they themselves created, what I'm sure they'll admit, the problems they themselves created. And it's easier said than done. For every bot army troll farm, I've yet to see social media initiatives, and there have been some, which are realistic, credible, and effective at fighting to get you out of these echo chambers and filter bubbles. I gave you the example just now. You can be radicalized online. Very hard to de-radicalize you online. So there are green shoots taking place in Singapore, and I apologize for talking so much just about my country, but also in Southeast Asia. Maybe Don can talk about the Thailand and the South, where people in diverse polyglot countries are brought together through interest groups in a way where they do things which I think formerly would have been considered risky, at least in my society. Talk in a frank, unartificial fashion about faith, about issues across each other's scriptural texts. These are grassroots, meaning not astroturfed initiatives to bring together people who are actually very, very different, who, if they went their own ways, would probably fall prey to these chambers, these social media bubbles. And I think social media can have a role in bringing these people together and bringing like-minded, credible sources of information and people to interface with them. I'm not saying you leave the room necessarily agreeing with each other. You're not going to have this wonderful kumbaya moment. But at least, and all the sociological studies show this, once you facilitate this bringing together of minds, you're at least leaving the room respecting the other person's point of view, even though you may not necessarily have been brought around to that person's point of view. And that's the hardest thing to do. But in my personal view, that's called discourse. That's what we used to have, but maybe have lost to some degree.
Thank you, Dr. Shashi, and please don't apologize. I think it's always great to hear the Singaporean perspective on free speech. It's always fun to hear. Thank you so much to our lineup of panelists today, and thank you so much for your questions. Thank you to Dr. Shashi Jayakumar of RSIS, Munirah Mustaffa of Chesseur Group, and Mr. Don Pathan joining us virtually of The Nation. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you again to everyone in the hall for having us and for your questions. Great stuff that we got out here today, and I would like to, I guess, wrap things up for the day and leave the rest to my friend Mior.
Thank you very much. May we request moderator and speakers to remain on stage as we go along with the closing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, before we end our forum today, I would like to invite Yang Berusaha, Mr. Nur Hisham Rosli, Acting Chief Executive Midas, to deliver his closing remarks.
Thank you, Major Mio. I'm just going to be short here, so we don't want to keep it so formal like this morning. Just bear with me for a few minutes or so, moderator and speakers. Okay, thank you, everyone, especially my dear friend, Tuan Haji Hadi bin Haji Mahmud, Deputy Secretary General of Ministry of Defense, Brunei Darussalam, and senior officials, obviously, distinguished speakers and moderators. Yeah. Well, we are on the final agenda, which is the wrap-up. Again, allow me to express our appreciation to all our esteemed speakers and moderators for the contribution to the forum. The insights and views are indeed significant to us. My thanks also goes to all foreign delegates and participants. Your active partaking made this forum more meaningful. I wish to do a little bit of summary on our discussion today. The first session discussed the present challenges, namely COVID-19 and the issue of Ukraine and Russia. All three ministers stressed the importance of multilateral institutions, and ASEAN has proved its effectiveness repeatedly. The foundation of ASEAN is still solid and needs good leadership, trust, and courage in dealing with present challenging issues. The second session discussed about CIMIC, civil-military cooperation. It's not a new concept and has been expanding over the years. It is obvious that interagency cooperation is key in CIMIC. It ensures synchronization in all CIMIC actions. It also requires trust and solid decision-making. Future challenges for CIMIC would be non-kinetic threats and the emergence of hybrid and warfare. Our panelists argued that CIMIC needs to be further explored and it needs strategic rethinking. The final session, which just ended, is about true or fake political narrative flowing on various social media platforms, public debates and argues about government action or inaction on many issues. Then we have OSIN, as the name suggests, which is open source, accessible to anyone. That meant anyone could make the analysis and share their views on social media. This topic is a new one and needs to be further discussed in the future, I believe, mainly to ensure the public has a balanced view of certain situations of conflict. But our speakers have done very well in sharing their views and thoughts on the subject. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, our sincere appreciation goes to ISIS Malaysia and obviously Astro Awani for making this event possible. I wish to thank the Secretariat who has put an enormous effort to ensure this event goes smoothly. I'm also proud of my colleagues at MIDAS who has been working tirelessly since December last year. Last but not least, let us keep up the Putrajaya Forum spirit alive, and I look forward to working with everyone again together in 2024. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nur Hisham. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause to our moderators and speakers. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, with that note, we have now come to the end of our event. On behalf of the organizer, I'm Major Mio, would like to extend our sincere gratitude to all distinguished speakers and moderators for their insightful and valuable contributions to the success of this forum. Appreciation is also extended to all distinguished guests for taking the time to be here with us today. We do hope that everybody will have an enjoyable exhibition and lovely stay here in Malaysia. Stay safe and have a pleasant evening. Thank you. Terima kasih.